preventing from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it.
Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Did you ever feel that things were not quite right? That everything was just ever so slightly askew?
Do you have, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind?
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
downloaded to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
And I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here. Revolution Radio. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Hello, pardon me. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talk Now Radio, listener-supported radio. I'm sorry, folks. I got tongue-tied on that one. Listen now to Talk Now, where no topic is taboo, and we're brought to you by Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps. And like I said in the introduction, this is listener-supported radio, so if you'd like to keep the servers on the air, donations and visiting affiliate links or anything like that you can do, telling your friends, inviting people to come with you and listen in, will always be a big help. We can get more people in the chat room, and we can have more fun. So today, I've got Daniel Unterbrink with me, and we're going to be talking about his book, Judas of Nazareth. Now, the one thing I never figured out after reading it is why he titled it Judas of Nazareth when the man that he's writing about was called Judas the Galilean, although it does make sense that Judas was called a Galilean and was also called a Nazareth at the same time, and he might have been making a connection with that. I can get him to clarify that in a minute. Wonderful read, folks. I really recommend this here book. I read it the whole way through. It's really one of those hard ones to put down. He's done a lot of in-depth research. He's put a lot of reading into this here, and I think once you do, if you do get it and read it, you'll see the work that he put into it for yourself. So, Daniel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, Royce. Glad to be with you.
I'm glad to be here myself. Sometimes I never know from one week to the next, but I am glad to be here whenever I can be here. Put it to you that way. So, Daniel, I don't think I asked you this when you were on my show at Talk Now Radio, but why did you actually title the book Judas of Nazareth if he was known as Judas the Galilean?
Well, actually, I didn't title the book that originally. Originally, I titled it, Who Was Jesus Really? That was the original title, and it was the publisher that changed it to Judas of Nazareth. And it is somewhat confusing because Judas, the town of Nazareth, as I put in my book, may not even have existed at this time. And if it did, it was just a small backwater, and it was used as a replacement for the term Nazarene, which were the kind of the troublemaking Jews. So essentially, the Gospels turned a Nazarene, who was someone in a group, that's a revolutionary group, into a geographical place, which would be Nazareth. So the publisher thought that people would be more interested if it was titled this. I explain the Nazareth in the book, that I don't think Judas definitely didn't come from Nazareth, and it might not even have existed at that time.
Okay. Well, I got to tell you, they did the same thing with Jesus, evidently, because they, said he was from Nazareth, and I've been knowing for years that Nazareth did not exist in that time. It did not come around for another, I think, 100 or 200 years, did it?
Yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no record of it anywhere in any of the Jewish records, and most Christian commentators even recognize that. Like I say, it was a transference of a revolutionary term into a geographical term. So Jesus or Judas the Galilean did not come from Nazareth, but it was just a catchy title, I guess, to maybe catch people's attention.
Okay. Well, I was telling everybody, and I actually put this in post all over Facebook, that you're contending, make sure I understood this correctly after reading the book, that Josephus, that Jesus is a literary creation of Josephus based on Judas the Galilean. Is that correct? Well,
Josephus talked about Judas the Galilean throughout his narrative of the first century A.D. He never mentions Jesus of Nazareth or anything to do with that type of movement that we see in the Gospels. So the historical record of Josephus supports Judas the Galilean. Now, Josephus had nothing to do with the creation of Jesus of Nazareth. He just doesn't mention him in his writings.
Oh, okay, so I did kind of misunderstand that one.
Yeah, because he didn't exist. I mean, a historian, it's kind of hard for him to write anything about a person that doesn't exist.
Well, yeah, this is one of the funny things about this is, and you may need to help me along with this, and I don't do dates real good, but Josephus, he was around about the time of the destruction of the temple, wasn't he?
Well, yeah, he was born in the mid-30s A.D. He actually fought with the Jewish resistance against Rome in the war with Rome, and then he was captured, and then he becomes a historian under the new emperors, Vespasian and Titus and Domitian. So he kind of had the moniker of being kind of a turncoat, because now he's working with the Romans. But he did live throughout the Jewish war, and he published Antiquities, which was the history of from Genesis on through the Jewish war. That was like 95 or 93 A.D. So he was around for quite a while, from the 30s through the 90s. AD.
Yes, well, what I was looking at was that would have put him to writing during the time that the New Testament Gospels were actually starting to pop up on the scene.
He was a contemporary of whoever wrote the New Testament. He was about the same time, and some of the New Testament materials, I think, derive from his writings. So, that's also included in some of the chapters, especially the Book of Acts is very heavily dependent on Josephus's writings.
Well, don't some of the other stuff in there also derive from other works as well, sort of like the virgin birth, the crucifixion, and some of the other things?
Some of the things they were pagan myths that were prevalent throughout the Roman Empire, and parts of those pagan myths were incorporated in the Jesus of Nazareth figure that was created after the Jewish War. So it was a post-70 A.D. invention, but they did incorporate a lot of the pagan myths. For instance, the story of Luke and the birth at the census, and the adoring shepherds, and being born around a cave and all that stuff. That came from the legend of Mithras, who was a very popular god, especially among the Roman troops. So there are elements in each gospel that you can point towards. Wow, this looks like something that was copied from something else, and most likely it was. But it was a way to bring the new Gentile follower into the movement, because if there's something familiar, that made it much more comfortable for the new adherents to the Gospels.
Kind of like making subtle little changes at a time till you got one big change.
Yeah, because, if everything would have been perfectly fine, the Gospel of Mark, which was the first written, would have just stayed the way it was. But yet Matthew took a lot of Mark, and the author added quite a bit of stuff. And then Luke took, I claim, Matthew and Mark, and then added his own ideas, plus using a lot of Josephus. The book of John takes the basic framework of Mark, but then adds an entirely new material. So if it was just one-time deal, you write it and then it stands for all time, there would have been no changes. But as time goes on, you have different audiences, and the writers were trying to appease their new audience. So they're adding things that would go over with their audience.
Which explains why each gospel is very unique, and each one stresses a different part. But before we go into that, I actually copied your URL, www.danielunterbrink.com, and then I forgot to paste it in the chat room. So I wanted to mention it to everybody real quick before I forgot again, because I got a bad habit. I'll get to talking, and then this stuff will slip right out of my mind. So one of the things I was going to mention, though, is I read in another book that Josephus was actually related to the Herodians. Did you hear anything about that? Or I think what they were saying was that Paul was related, and some people were claiming that Josephus and Paul, and I think you told me on my show that they weren't the same person, but that's what some people think.
Yeah, I don't think that Josephus and Paul were the same person. Josephus actually mentions a person in his history called Saul, who matches up directly with what we consider the Apostle Paul from the book of Acts. A lot of the same events are occurring to that person. So Josephus is talking about another individual. Now, and Josephus was probably very supportive of the Herodian kings in his writings especially, and Paul himself was a cousin of Agrippa I, who was a king of Israel from 37 to 44 A.D. So, there are connections to the Herodian classes. These were the ruling elites of the time. They made a lot of money. Herod the Great, for example, was the first Herodian king, and he appoints the high priests at the temple. And after that, from the time he appoints them in around 25 B.C. all the way to 70 A.D., which is almost 95 years, the high priesthood stayed within one or two families. So it was an entire monopoly on who was running the high priesthood, and they were appointed by the Herodians or by Rome. So the people were upset by that because these guys had no business running the priesthood. I mean, they were brought in from Egypt originally, So the amount of money and the corruption was just rampant in first century.
Okay, now, also when you read the Bible, you hear Jesus kind of denouncing the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He warns his disciples to be careful of their poison. Do other records, secular records of the time, mirror that type of attitude of the Pharisees and Sadducees, or is that something that was just mainly in the New Testament?
I think that probably relates more to a later time. At the time of Judas the Galilean, Josephus even calls him a Pharisee. And Judas the Galilean also used many of the Essene practices. So you could say he was kind of a mix of the Pharisees and the Essenes. Now, the Sadducees, on the other hand, aligned themselves with the Herodians, and they were the rich people in the power structure. Judas the Galilean would have been opposed to those. So when you read in the Gospels and they're mixing the Herodians and Pharisees and Sadducees all together in a mix, that's not really being honest with the times, because the Pharisees and the Sadducees did not, go hand in hand. Sometimes they were very strong opponents of one another. And the Herodians were friends with Rome, which would have been the exact opposite of what a insurrectionist movement like what Judas the Galilean was leading. Jesus is put to death in the Gospels for refusing to pay taxes to Rome. So, he's the same type of deal. He was up against the Herodian establishment against the Romans and the Sadducees. Those three elements were the power structure. So you kind of have to look at it almost like the poor versus the rich. The rich people are in the power establishment. The poor people are vying for some sort of a life for themselves. Jesus in the Gospels and Judas the Galilean, they appealed to the poorer people. So, and they were Judas the Galilean was very nationalistic. He wanted to kick the Romans out of Judea, and that's why he was so popular among the poor people, among most of the Pharisees and a lot of the Essenes.
Now, during the time of Judas the Galilean, was he thought of as the look for Messiah, do you know?
Actually, in 4 BC, Judas and Matthias, and I think Matthias probably was his father, but that's up for interpretation. They cleansed the temple, and both of them were caught. Matthias was put to death, and Judas was held prisoner, and later there was a prisoner release. So you have the Barabbas prisoner release happened actually in 4 BC. Okay, and the New Testament writers, put it in under Pilate under 30 AD. So the actual prisoner release was in 4 BC. Well, after Judas becomes a free man, he goes to Galilee, gets his supporters together, and at that point they do make him a Messiah figure. Now, there were other Messiah figures at the same time because nobody wanted to be under the Herodian rule. So, if you have a pretty good-sized land, it's not like today where, you have instant communications. One area might be controlled by one group of people, another area might be controlled by another group. But certainly Judas was one of the most successful Messiah figures in around 4 to 2 BC. So he was considered a Messiah to his followers.
So don't they have trouble figuring out which one was the true Messiah with so many around at one time?
Well, a lot of them were put to death. You can read through Josephus, and he mentions that such and such a Messiah figure had a large following, but the Romans caught him, put him to death. Well, when they're put to death, that's a good sign that they're not the Messiah. Okay? Now, the interesting thing with the Jesus story, or Judas the Galilean, he's eventually put to death. He eventually is killed by the Romans, but his group came up with this novel idea that he's going to come back, the resurrection. So even though he's now dead, they still can gain followers because they're promising that he's going to come back and defeat the Romans. So it was really an ingenious plan, whether it was thought up by Judas the Galilean or by his disciples later. I don't think we'll ever know, but it did work, because if you didn't have that plan and your Messiah figure is killed, what are you going to do? It's going to be very hard to recruit if your Messiah figure is dead, if he was crucified, because that was a sign of failure in Judea.
And of course, now they're still waiting for Jesus to come back and fight the Romans 2,000 years later, and still swearing he's going to come. That's a pretty strong belief.
That he's going to come back?
Yeah.
Well, they did believe in resurrection. So tying it to the times, and people were desperate. A lot of times people will hold on to something that, if you really thought about it, you go, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But in their religion, there was nothing that said that a person wasn't resurrected. And their idea was that he was going to come back and lead them in a war against Rome. And if you read the book of Revelation, where Jesus reappears, who's he fighting? He's fighting Rome, the city on the seven hills. This is the fight that the Jewish Christians, the Jewish Jesus movement, actually wanted to have, and they thought that Judas the Galilean / Jesus was going to come back and lead them. It didn't happen, unfortunately, and they were all slaughtered around 70 A.D.
So, what do you think the motives were for doing this literary creation of Jesus instead of just writing history the way it was?
Well, you have to remember there were the history of the Jesus movement. You have to look in the first century up through around 35 A.D. There was a uniform movement. It was the Jewish Jesus movement, as I've termed it, or the fourth philosophy. They were essentially the zealots. Okay, that's the easy way of looking at it. They were following the law. They practiced water baptism. They practiced righteousness. Their idea was that they follow the law, that they will be in step with what God wants them to do. Now, around 35 A.D., Paul kind of changes. He creates his own gospel, which is separate or different from what was originally followed by Judas the Galilean, John the Baptist, Peter, and James. They all followed the law. Paul created a new gospel based on revelations from the risen Christ. He never met the real human Messiah. His revelations came from the risen Christ, and he said that he received his gospel from the risen Christ, not from any man, nor did any man teach him this thing. So this is a totally new gospel that he's presenting. So here you have 35 to 37 A.D., you have now a split where you have two different gospels being preached. And if you go back and get your New Testament and read the book of Galatians, read Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and then think of the Jewish gospel versus Paul's new gospel to the Gentiles, they're preaching two totally different things. One is based on the law, the other is based on the blood of Christ, which was not talked about by the Jewish Jesus movement. So at that point, you've got a split.
That's true, and I think I mentioned this to you when we was doing that show together on Talk Now Radio, that it had come to my attention that the God of the Old Testament was a moon god, and that all the feast days were lunar as well as the worship day, whereas the New Testament God, everything was solar. You would have thought during that days of Jesus that everybody would have picked up on that, wouldn't you?
Well, I mean, I was explaining the two different movements, and then what happens after that. Paul's movement becomes very strong, but eventually the Jewish movement catches on to what Paul's preaching, and then they kick him out of the movement in around 44 A.D. Now, most people don't realize this, but there's also a passage in Josephus that talks about the same sort of confrontation that Peter and Paul had at Antioch. Okay, so Paul's now out of the movement. So his movement is starting to wane. So the Jewish Jesus movement is going along perfectly fine until around 66, 70 AD, and then they're wiped out by the Romans. That creates a huge vacuum, at which time Paul now steps in again, and he's the one that creates Jesus of Nazareth based upon his new gospel, which was invented around 35 AD, and it has nothing to do with the actual historical gospel. So, the continuity with anything Jewish actually ends because the new Jesus of Nazareth, even though he's born Jewish, his entire life and ministry is to try to move away from Judaism, and that is what Paul had done. So you see that Jesus of Nazareth was kind of created in Paul's own image, and that might answer your question of the lunar versus the solar, because the idea of Jesus of Nazareth that was created post 70 AD has nothing to do with Judaism anymore.
Right, and that became really quite well obvious, especially when, like I was mentioning before on the other show, that Jesus himself quoted that, the law shall not pass or shall in no way change, not one jot or one tittle. And this is not an exact quote, but it goes along with what you were showing about what because Paul was teaching an opposite gospel, in other words. And Jesus was confirming that the law was going to be there until all things had been fulfilled. And Paul comes along and says, no, the old law was weak, it doesn't work, and now we got a new covenant. So, you're looking into a New Testament that is contradicting itself between Jesus and Paul right there.
Right. Yeah, and if you look at Jesus in the New Testament, you pick out strains of what you would consider to be two different people. You look at it, the Pacific Christ, where he just doesn't want anything to do with anything that would promote violence. Then you see the other, the Judas the Galilean figure also. The person that's actually put to death because he refuses to pay taxes to Rome. So you've got this clever mixture, and that's why there have been so many different movements throughout the ages. People focus in on one aspect of this composite figure to follow. And it is confusing. There's no doubt about that. But
they're picking the aspect that agrees with them the most.
Right. It's what they want to follow.
Right.
There aren't too many people today that pick the passage where Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler, and the fella says, what else should I do to follow you? And Jesus says, give all your money to the poor, then come follow me. And said the rich young man went away sad because he had great wealth. Well, most people today have, that live in middle class societies or have a lot of money. They go to church and everything, but they don't want to focus in on give everything you have to the poor. That is not a part of the Christian message today, because if it was, you'd lose a lot of support. People wouldn't follow it.
That's true. You got people like Creflo Dollar that preach a real good, feel good, get rich gospel.
Yeah, and that had nothing to do with the original Messiah. The original Messiah was a hero of the poor, and the whole idea was that they were going to share with one another. That was the kingdom of God, the sharing. The feeding of the 5,000 is a good example, where the people go out to see him, and Jesus has his disciples share their loaves and fishes with each other as an example for the other people to follow. And so the miracle wasn't that Jesus created something out of thin air. The miracle was that people shared with one another. And people don't want to focus in on that. because that would take an actual commitment and something that, it's easier to just say, oh, I believe this, as opposed to saying, oh, I have to do this. So it's a totally different gospel than what we have today.
Yeah, I would agree. Very much totally different. And the one thing that really came to my attention while I was reading your book, and I mean, I've read the Bible many times over, but it just didn't stand out like it did when I was reading your book, and you kind of highlighted it, in other words. So is the fact that even in the New Testament, they were taking things that Jesus was saying that was anti-Roman and putting a Roman spin on them and kind of confusing the issue there in an effort to kind of make it sound like Jesus was on the Roman side, in other words.
Yeah, I think the greatest example of that is the passage that talks about give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God. If you look at Paul, what Paul says in Romans 13, Paul says essentially obey your government, pay your taxes, essentially be a good citizen to Rome. Now, in Luke, the 23rd chapter, one of the charges brought against Jesus was that he refused to pay taxes to Rome. So here you've got, this is what Jesus was crucified for, the refusal to pay taxes to Rome. And yet Paul, on the other hand, is saying, pay your taxes to Rome and be good citizens. So, the teachings are totally opposite. So when we read the give to Caesar what is Caesar, give to Rome what is Rome, a lot of times we read Paul's interpretation into that. In reality, it was a zealot message where Jesus asked to see a coin, and he sees, and they show him, and it's a picture of Caesar. So he says, essentially, take your coins and give them to Caesar, but at the same time, what is God's, give to God. And what is God's was the land and all the resources of Judea. So essentially, he's telling the Romans to take their money and get out of Judea, which was a revolutionary statement and one reason why he was put to death. And again, this is totally missed by most people. It's very fundamental in the history of what really happened.
Now, one of the things I noticed that you did in your book was you broke everything down gospel by gospel and showed many different verses from each one, quoting what was said and, giving your commentary on what you thought, who was really saying what and what was really meant at the time. Can you tell us a little something about that?
Okay, well, first of all, I started out with the Gospel of Mark because that was the first gospel that was written. And I also claim that was written by Paul because there are like 30 different instances, which I document in here, where the life of Jesus is actually patterned after the life of Paul, and the teachings of Jesus are patterned after the teachings of Paul. And this is totally inconsistent with the history of what we know from Josephus and what actually was going on at the time that Jesus supposedly lived. Okay, this is a post-70 AD creation. One example that is interesting and might be interesting to a lot of female listeners is that in the Gospels, Jesus is celibate. He's not a married man. In Josephus's writings, there were four groups. There were the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and the fourth philosophy of Judas the Galilean. Of those four groups, only one of them did not marry, and that were the Essenes. So people can say, well, Jesus might have been an Essene. But then we know from Paul's writings that Peter was married, that Jesus' brothers were married, and all the apostles were married. And that's from 1 Corinthians 9:5. So if everybody in the movement is married, then there's a good chance Jesus was married too. But where we get the idea that Jesus wasn't married is that Paul himself was celibate. And Paul claimed that he was much superior to the other apostles because he could work harder because he didn't have to worry about the worries of this life and, having a wife and children and everything like that. The Messiah figure, on the other hand, would have had a wife, would have had children. He would have been functioning in society as a good Jewish husband. This was normal. But yet in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus comes off as now a celibate, which is totally unrealistic. So in the Gospel of Mark, the whole idea is to create a person, a Messiah figure that is infused with Pauline teachings. Even to the point where, on the one hand, Jesus is entering Jerusalem as a Messiah figure. He's riding in on a donkey, and which is a messianic promise in Zechariah, and he's cleansing the temple, which again was a messianic move. At the same time, privately, he's telling people, and I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be put to death. Now, these two things do not mesh. They don't make sense. Either that or Jesus was totally messing with everybody's heads, because they were expecting him to be a real Messiah and that he was going to get rid of the Romans. The Gospel of Mark now creates a figure that is infused with Paul, so that those Pauline teachings are more important than the history of the times. So that's essentially what you have in Paul. Matthew adds other elements that, like a verse scenario that Mark doesn't have. He also makes it a point to make sure that the Jews are blamed for the death of Jesus and not the Romans. And at the end of Matthew, who worships, who claims that Jesus is the Son of God? It's the Roman centurion. It's not the Jewish followers. So at every step of the way, you see the Jews being pushed back farther and farther into their own corner, and it's the Gentiles who are now the acceptable ones to Jesus and to God. Luke does the same thing. He adds a few interesting points that I think are more historical than what might be in Matthew and Mark, such as the actual reasons why Jesus was put to death, and that he claimed to be a Messiah, and he refused to pay taxes to Rome, and that's why he was put to death. One other interesting thing in Luke that you don't see in the other Gospels is that after Jesus comes in on the donkey, and that's to play on the Zechariah chapter 9, which said that he would ride in on a donkey. So that's a messianic claim. He also has his disciples bring 2 swords to the Mount of Olives, which again, you wouldn't think that the Prince of Peace would have his disciples bring any weapons to the Mount of Olives, but yet Jesus does. And then you have to ask the question, why does he do that? Well, later in the book of Zechariah, on the Mount of Olives, there was supposed to be a great confrontation between the followers of the Messiah and the Gentiles. And at that point, the Messiah, with just a little bit of fight, would win. So when Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives with the 2 swords, he's expecting to win. And what happens, he's captured, and that might explain why he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Because he actually believed that he was doing what God wanted, and that God was going to rescue him and the nation, and it didn't happen. So that's just a few differences from those 3 Gospels, and then you get into John, and it's a whole different ball game, where Jesus now is the creator of the universe. With God, he creates the universe, which not even the first 3 Gospels would have had the nerve to say. But now, in the Gospel of John, Jesus is God. So, there's a development. There's a little bit of truth everywhere. It's just trying to find out what matches the historical record and what, how you can make sense of of all the items. I mean, it's not an easy task.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, the whole Bible thing, I think, is, kind of hard to wrap your head around if you really start studying it pretty heavy. But I was going to mention, everybody, if y'all got any questions out there, don't be bashful. Put them in the chat room. Call in at 347-688-2902. We can always, what I usually like to do, folks, is if you call in while the guest is speaking, just sit there and listen. And as soon as I get a breaking point, I'll cue you in, because as far as I know, Skype don't have any hold buttons. So that way at least you'll know what to expect. Now, coming back to the subject at hand, which is the New Testament, there was something I had on the tip of my tongue just a minute ago. When I stopped to ask people about the calling in and chat, it left my mind for a minute. I hate it when that happens. You just think of one thing and then you shift your attention and then you lose what you had. Now,
you need to write it down.
Or type it down on document. Because I remember your book was really very, very, it was a pretty good sized reading. It was very in-depth and very detailed. But there was something I meant to ask about that. Now, you say you don't know who it was that actually wrote these New Testament Gospels, do you?
Well, I claim that the Gospel of Mark was probably, now no one can 100% prove who wrote this Gospel or that Gospel, but from what I think and what I have documented is there's probably only one individual that could have come up with the Gospel of Mark, and that would have been Paul. Because, like I said, the new Jesus of Nazareth is infused with Pauline theology. Even Paul's own lifestyle is in there. Part of Paul's history is in there. And Paul was still alive at this time, unlike what church history has Paul dying in 64 AD in Rome with Peter during the Great Fire of Rome when Nero killed all the Christians. But in reality, according to Josephus, Saul met Nero in Greece in 67 AD. So Saul, this is when Mark is written, is only a few years later, and at that point, after the destruction of Jerusalem, Paul is looking at a field that is totally open to him. Nobody knows the history of the times better than he does. He has knowledge to the Dead Sea Scrolls, of which, as I've mentioned in my book, part of Paul's writings plus the Gospel of Mark are kind of an inversion of a lot of the ideas in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Professor Robert Eisenman goes in great detail detailing all of that. And so, to me, there's only one individual that really had the know-it-all to put that gospel together, and that would have been Paul. Now, who wrote Matthew? I think it was probably a follower of Paul, because Paul might have been dead by then. That was like 80 AD. Who wrote Luke? That might have been closer to 90 AD. Paul would have probably been dead again, but it was a follower, somebody that, because they're incorporating the majority of Mark into their own Gospels. They're just now marketing it to a different group of people, so they're including other elements. But the key to the thing, I think, is that the Gospel of Paul is the one that lives on. The original Gospel of Judas the Galilean, John the Baptist, was wiped out, and it does not exist today. Everybody today follows the Gospel of Paul, which is embodied in the Jesus of Nazareth.
Now, in the chat room, Patrick was saying, Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered something to the effect of God or the Son of God, but it was Peter who said that, not Jesus. Now, I know the passage he's talking about, and that's not an exact wording, but it's pretty much the gist, as I'm sure you know. And I think what Patrick may not be thinking about at the time is the fact that you're looking at what was written that Peter said or that Jesus said, not necessarily what Peter or Jesus either one said, in other words.
Right, and there would have been nobody jotting these things down at the time. This was written by a much later time, and even that passage, and I'm there. I don't know if it's from Mark or Matthew, where Peter claims that Jesus is the Messiah, but then later Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan," because Peter doesn't understand what Jesus really intends. Okay, which Peter was thinking that Jesus was going to be the Messiah as opposed to a human sacrifice, is what Jesus looks to be in the Gospels. Now, that same idea of Peter being Satan is found in Paul's Gospel, where Paul talks about Paul's writings, his letters to the 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about the super apostles, and he says they're apostles of Satan. So even that passage kind of reflects the idea that Paul had and the confrontations he had with Peter, and he puts it into the Gospels as being Jesus versus Peter. I don't think there was ever a problem between Peter and Jesus. They were on the same page. On the other hand, Peter and Paul had a huge difference. In Galatians, we find out that Peter turned his back on Paul, and all the other Jews did too, because they finally found out what he was teaching.
Okay, I want to make a note that Patrick has typed in chat again. He said, "Oh, absolutely, that Redneck Radio Man, I'm aware. It was all a report." I wanted to apologize to him for that. I must have misunderstood, what he meant with his first typing. So, I said publicly what he had said before, so I thought I'd just make a public apology as well, since it seemed only fair.
Well, I mean, that's part of the confusion, is when, these documents, the Gospels were written from 70 A.D. to 100 A.D., but they're supposed to reflect the history in 20 and 30 A.D. And they're totally different, because in 20 and 30 A.D. it's in Judea, and it's in a Jewish environment, and all the ideas were Jewish. And you can look through Josephus to find out what people believed at that time. Now, the Gentile ideals of 70 to 100 A.D. have nothing to do with the original Jewish Messiah. But yet we read it into it and just assume that Jesus said these things, or Peter said such and such, and that might not be the case.
Now,
we just have to be a little careful when we look at the documents.
That's true. Very careful, because things has been and will continue to be misunderstood in that, and it will be continually controversial. But one thing that I was going to mention, because I forgot it earlier, I'm trying to remember it right now, is the fact being that somewhere from the Old Testament to the New Testament, we got Jesus turning into a God-man, actually being God himself in human form. But I don't know of anywhere in the Old Testament that was prophesying that he would be God incarnate. In other words, for example, do you?
Well, wouldn't that be a false God? In the Old Testament, there was one God. And if you're putting up a human being as being God, that in and of itself was idolatry. And then you can look at some of the other, for instance, the human sacrifice. In the Old Testament, in Leviticus 20 and in Deuteronomy 18, a human sacrifice to God was a detestable practice. God didn't want to see that. But yet, the whole idea of Christianity as we have it today is that God sacrificed his own son, the very thing that he forbid any of his followers to do. So again, we have this huge inconsistency. And also, believing in the blood of Christ, again, this is what the pagans of the time believed in, slaughtering the blood of a lamb or a bull or whatever, and that would represent the blood of their God. The Jews did not partake in the drinking of blood. It was written that they weren't supposed to. So again, these whole ideas are from the pagan world, not from the Jewish scriptures. So the whole idea of Jesus being a God or the Son of God in the sense that he is actually God is sheer paganism, has nothing to do with Judaism.
Okay.
And that would have been total idolatry.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and a lot of people didn't really realize that at the time they read the New Testament either. But, yeah, that was just part of the thing. As I understand it from what I've researched online, that Constantine was the first one to want to turn Jesus into a God-man, wasn't it?
Well, actually, the gospel writer in Mark, like the first paragraph, it says Jesus, the Son of God. So actually, from 70 A.D. on, and actually, even if you go back to Paul's original gospel with his revelations from the risen Christ, he is moving in that direction at that point of making the Jewish Messiah into a god, because this was comfortable for his Gentile followers. They're coming out of pagan religions that kind of believe the same things. So Constantine, he makes it the religion of the state, but he didn't invent the idea that Jesus was a god. That was invented probably by Paul. Slowly it developed, and by the time the book of John is written, now Jesus, not only the Son of God, he now is God, the creator of the universe, which I've always found kind of hard to believe. But, I mean, it just doesn't make sense in the historical timeline of the Jewish nation.
Now, M.J. Tom in the chat room was asking, what about the Egyptian Bible? I'm not sure what he meant by that, but he might be asking, was the Egyptian Bible any way similar to our Bible, by the way?
I'm not sure what he means by the Egyptian Bible.
Maybe he'll clarify that here in just a second in the chat room.
And I would not be an expert by any means on that, but no, I'm not real sure what he means by that.
I know, me personally, I've never seen an Egyptian Bible, but I've read some 7 odd different versions of the Bible that most everybody else reads. I mean, the Donors, the Dewey, and
Yeah, but I don't know if I really don't know what he means by that.
Well, I haven't seen him clarify in the chat room yet. I'm still waiting. Well, Patrick said Book of the Dead. I wonder if he did mean Book of the Dead. And I wonder, is there anything in the Book of the Dead about Jesus? I think somebody once said that you could decipher the coming of Jesus in the Egyptian pyramid or in the Book of the Dead or something like that. But I'm not sure what the story on that is. I mean, I haven't read about it in a long time.
I really have no idea on that.
Yeah.
I will plead ignorance on that point.
I think I'm going to look up on that one. It sounds pretty interesting to me. Okay, he's saying here, well, it's basically a precursor to the Old Testament or King James point as our Western religion text mocks their own Bible. It's not the Book of the Dead. Huh. Well, I'll have to look into that and learn a little bit more about it. That's a different book entirely, he believes. Okay. So evidently there is an Egypt. You know what, though? Somebody claimed that Mark went to Egypt after the death of Jesus and wrote the Coptic text, but I'm not sure if that was just theory.
Yeah, they don't know who wrote these texts. They really don't. A lot of it's based on traditions. But, if you ever travel in Europe, you find out that traditions are developed a lot of times to bring in money. You can attach like the bones, the relics of the saints, and a church will have a bone and they will show it, and so that will get pilgrims to come in. Well, those pilgrims spend money. It's a good way for a town or a village, to keep their economy going. And the whole idea is that is there any truth to it? Maybe, but most likely not. So we have to be kind of careful with some of the traditions and stuff that are talked about.
Well, yeah, because everybody's got their own version of it, too. And if people would be amazed, Daniel, when they start reading the Bibles, or they start reading the New International versus the King James versus Donors, Good News, and etc., how different and what different things the Bible says from one Bible to the next.
Yeah, I mean, you can also, if you're a real student of the Bible, you can get one of these Greek interlinear Bibles, which has the Greek and it has the English underneath it, and then they also have an interpretation on the side. There aren't too many of us, and I'm not an expert. I really don't know any Greek and Latin. I was an auditor. I put together stuff based on other people's interpretations. So if I knew the Greek and Latin, I could probably make more points in my defense. But yet I don't. So I accept what other scholars have written, in these interpretations. But sometimes you can compare, and there might be a word that might be useful to look up. For instance, I'll give you an example. When Paul talks about on the night of Jesus' arrest, he talks about on the night he was betrayed. And in the New Testament versions, most of them, it says betrayed. So you get the idea that there's Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus.
Well, with that, hate to interrupt you, Daniel, but you can hear the break time music is starting. So we'll recontinue this as soon as break is over.
Okay.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Hello, I'm Benjamin.
And I'm Jasmine.
We are inner tour guides with black belts in the art of self-awareness and how to live a passionate life.
We love talking with you about what you have and what you want.
More importantly, we want to explore with you how to bridge the gap between that wanting and bring it right back to the having.
So what are your hopes, dreams, and desires?
Is it money, love, success, health, wealth, or something even more specific?
Let us guide you through the exciting adventure of turning what you want into what you have.
Come join in the conversation on our show, The Inner Revolution.
We look forward to exploring with you.
Hey, Truther Junkies, it's me, Angela Black, and I'm back. Join me every weekday except for Wednesdays from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern, Studio B on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com for my news show At This Moment 2014. See you there.
The finder of lost children and missing persons. Monique Lassan. Surveilling civil and criminal investigations. I investigate.
No, I am the chosen one.
Do not underestimate the power of good, and do not dismiss the strength of the child.
Yes, every Wednesday evening on Revolution Radio, come join our very own investigatrix, Monique Lassan, with her private X-Files.
So you're the finder of lost children.
Private X-Files, every Wednesday from 10 to midnight Eastern, Studio B on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com.
I realize it's very hard for you to take in. But is your destiny to find the golden child?
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please have your attention? I've just been handed an urgent news story, and I need all of you to stop what you're doing and listen.
Hey folks, Captain Nighthawk here. Do you have a favorite host? Well, imagine if you will having all the broadcast shows from 2013 to listen to anytime you want. Awesome deal, huh? Anyway, so stop by freedomslips.com and order the entire 2013 library. of your favorite host for just $30. Not only do you help with the station funding to keep us on the air, you also help the host because they get half of the net on every order. Also, we have Revolution Radio's all-time favorite shows all on one disc. The details are really broad, so you'll have to visit the website and go look at the details yourself. It's, again, www.freedomslips.com/season2013.htm and get your favorites. First come, first serve, 7 to 21 days for delivery. Thank you. This is Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps, including me. Later.
We've got to stop them! They're going to kill us all!
Join Revolution Radio every Wednesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time on Studio B for Momentary Zen with host Zen Garcia at freedomslips.com, the People Station.
He wants a challenge. Let's give him one.
The voice that whispers in your ears are the screams that you fear. The mind you cannot defy is the heart that rules mankind. The people who made you are the gods that will save you. I am Steve Travesty. I am the voice. The ghost in the machine. Ghost in the Machine. Tuesdays, 8 p.m. Studio A.
Right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps. Revolution Radio. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Okay, everybody, now we're back from break time, and I hope everybody got some water, coffee, whatever they needed to enjoy the rest of the show, have a little snack with you or whatever. So, Daniel, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, that's good. Now, I was going to also ask you, we're going into the last hour of the show, and I'm not sure if I've actually brought out any points in the book that you wanted to bring out and highlight.
Well, I think an important aspect of, I'm claiming that Judas the Galilean was the real Messiah. But there are other figures of the time like John the Baptist. That person needs to fit into any new theory and make sense. I think John the Baptist could possibly be the smoking gun behind the whole thing. According to the Gospels, John the Baptist comes onto the scene around 28-29 A.D., the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. Okay? He spends maybe a year and a half, who knows, definitely not a long time, and then he's put to death by Herod Antipas at the request of his wife. So, according to the Gospels, John the Baptist is on the scene for maybe 2 years at most. Now, that figure, John the Baptist, if we go into the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, we know that according to Josephus, John the Baptist did not die in 30 A.D., he died in 36 A.D. Okay, in 36 AD, he was put to death by Herod Antipas, the same person that puts him to death in the Gospels. But the reason why he puts John to death is that John had a great following of people, and Herod was afraid that John would cause a rebellion against him. So all of a sudden you're throwing, Josephus is putting all this political stuff into it, which you don't see in the Gospels. Okay, so according to Josephus, he dies in 36 AD. So then we have to say, well, when did he come onto the scene? Well, the Gospel again said he came onto the scene at 29 AD. There's a document known as the Slavonic Josephus that introduces John the Baptist in 6 AD, right before the introduction of Judas the Galilean. And in that introduction of John the Baptist, he is preaching the exact same things that Josephus attributes to Judas the Galilean and his partner, Sadduc. And Sadduc is another term for a righteous one that teaches righteousness. And that's exactly what John's baptism was. It was a baptism of righteousness. So in the history of Josephus, we see this figure, John the Baptist, is actually around from 6 AD to 36 AD. He has a huge swell of support. In fact, for a long time after Judas the Galilean is put to death, he is the actual leader of the Jewish Jesus movement. But people don't realize it because essentially the Gospels, he's been written out of the story. You know, all you see is of him in the Gospels is he's introducing Jesus, and then he kind of slips into the background and he's put to death. But in reality, he was a very influential person. And even when you look at the writings of Paul, they're still talking about water baptism at that point. And that could have been in the late 30s to early 40s. So John the Baptist was a much more important figure, and he fits into the Judas the Galilean hypothesis much better than he does in the typical Christian ideas. I don't think too many people have focused in on, when he came onto the scene and when he actually died, which really screws up the entire traditional Christian timeline.
Well, did John the Baptist or the other guys you named, did he baptize Judas the Galilean?
My guess is he probably did. I mean, there's nothing in Josephus or the Slavonic Josephus that said that he did, but I think Judas the Galilean took him as a co-teacher, because Judas the Galilean originally was co-teaching with Matthias. Matthias was put to death, so sometime after 4 BC, John the Baptist or Sadduc becomes his second in command. So they patterned their selves after the Maccabees, who had thrown out the Greek rulers in the 2nd century BC. So they weren't totally original in their thinking. They patterned themselves, and they all had nicknames, And that's one thing that people say. Well, Judas the Galilean wasn't named Jesus. He might have been. That might have been his nickname. John the Baptist was called the Baptist because that's what he did. Peter, Simon was named Peter. Saul was named Paul. So they all had nicknames, and that was also patterned after the Maccabees, who also had nicknames. So this whole movement was patterned after an earlier movement, but sometimes the writings of Josephus, you might have their real names, and in the New Testament documents, you might see their nicknames. So while Josephus might talk about John, the New Testament will always say John the Baptist. Okay, so you have, and also Josephus always said Saul. New Testament says Saul becomes Paul because Paul is now his nickname. So don't get hung up on the nicknames, because that was something that people within the movement knew you by, but not necessarily an outsider like Josephus. Josephus
right.
wouldn't have been calling Judas the Galilean Jesus, because he was not a Christian. He was not a follower of Judas the Galilean.
But now,
So,
I'm
go ahead.
sorry, I didn't know you were fixing to speak. I apologize.
No, go ahead. I was done.
I was just reading in the chat room. I guess this guy might be joking because it doesn't make any sense to me at all. But he got a question mark behind it. A bunch of them, in fact, says, "What's the difference between Zionism squirrels and Orthodox squirrels?" It looked like he wanted me to ask that question. I got no clue why, though. Doesn't make any sense to you either, does it?
No.
Okay, well, maybe he'll clarify on that in a couple of minutes or reveal to us what he had in mind one way or the other. But at any rate, coming back to the story at hand, in any case, in the end, Paul's movement was the only one that survived. Is that correct?
Yeah, it wasn't his original, which I term the Christ movement, where he has his revelation. The Jesus of Nazareth movement, which is created after the Jews are wiped out, that is what really we have today. And that was created by kind of fusing the life and teachings of Paul with the original Jewish Messiah. So that's what we have today, and that's kind of it's not the original. It's kind of a copy, and it's a kind of what you would call a pagan copy of the original.
Okay. Let's see, I'm losing my place here trying to keep up with chat and keep up with you at the same time. I was looking for that guy to enhance what he was talking about, but I think it was some kind of a, from what I'm listening to in the chat room, secret language type of thing going on there. Something about it spells Jews somehow. I don't know what he meant by that, but okay, I think I better leave that one alone because it's confusing me. Back to the topic at hand. Where were we at now? Now, didn't you also have something in your book that talked about Paul writing part or inserting part of the Revelations? Or was it Saul?
No, I didn't put anything about him. I just said that the Messiah that was going to come back in the book of Revelation was going to come back and destroy Rome. Okay, the Roman Empire. And that, I don't think that had anything to do with Paul. That was probably written by a Jewish nationalist that was, that's
right.
what they wanted. That's what they hoped for.
I might be getting that transposed with another book I read and overlapping it there a little bit, and if I am, I do apologize for that. I read a lot of books on this here subject, by the way. And sometimes they do overlap.
Yeah, and you always have to put things in perspective of when they're written, who they're written to, because that helps figure out, what their motives were, who the audience is. You don't want to assume that things that were written in 100 AD actually occurred in 20 AD because you don't know that. Yeah, they have to be consistent with the facts. And that's what I've tried to do is kind of build the case on what was there and using all the primary documents. For instance, the primary documents would be Josephus, because he didn't have any reason to promote or to denigrate Christianity. He's just writing what he considered to be the history of the Jews, and he lived there. And yet he does not mention a Jesus of Nazareth movement. So that in itself is you kind of wonder why. So some of the other historical documents that I consider primary would be Tacitus or Suetonius, and even though they wrote in the 2nd century, they again have no axe to grind. They're pretty much putting it from their own point of view. I also consider Paul's original letters to be a primary document because even though he's very biased in his position versus James or Peter, at least he's talking about events of the time. So you can kind of go through and try to figure out, where he's at, where James is at, where Peter's at, and use his documents along with history to try to figure it out. Now, what I've put as secondary documents that most people today make primary are the Gospels and the Slavonic Josephus. I want to make sure I don't want to use them as a primary source because they're written by people that have something to gain by their writings. We don't know if Jesus of Nazareth is true, so why should we accept the Gospels as being 100% infallible? That just doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that in any other historical field. You'd take the historians first, and then you would look at the religious writings and compare them to what's in history.
Unless, of course, the claim was made that the other historian was representing God, then all of a sudden he has to be taken. I mean, that's the only difference between the Bible or the New Testament and any other historian's book is they're claiming to be of God. I guess once you put that on there, it becomes the gospel truth.
Well, that's why, I think Bill O'Reilly just wrote a new book called Killing Jesus, and he wants it to be taught as a history book, but he uses the Gospels for his history. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second. The histories of the time were written by Josephus, and he actually was a first-hand eyewitness to a lot of that, or he interviewed people that were, and he had all the documents, but yet the Gospel writers, they might have had so little influence in Judea that why would you consider that to be more historical than the writings of Josephus? That, to me, doesn't make sense. And I think that's the big error that not only like a Bill O'Reilly would make, but most church pastors, most historians. Because, number one, if something doesn't agree with the Bible, they just assume it's not true. Instead of looking at it from a common sense approach and say, wait a second, if we've got a discrepancy, let's try to figure it out. And that's what I've tried to do in my book. If I have a discrepancy between what Josephus says and what the book of Acts says, let's try to figure out what is right, what is not, as opposed to just accepting one as the gospel truth,
right?
The New Testament and Acts.
Well, in that same token, it'd be kind of hard to take Josephus' historical record, at least the whole entire thing, given the fact that he was a turncoat, wouldn't it?
Well, he's got really some biases. He's heavily in favor of the Herodians. He speaks highly of most of them, and he's very, very negative towards the followers of Judas the Galilean. Although he does say some admirable things about Judas, like he's a clever rabbi, or that the people thought he was one of the most eloquent teachers. He does give him that, but at the same time, he calls the wonder workers the worst plague, essentially, on the country because they were leading people astray. Well, Jesus was a wonder worker. So he's very negative about these type of people. The people that were sharing their property with one another, and again, this is part of early Christianity, he called them lunatics. So again, you got to look at where he's coming from, and you got to filter out a little bit of that because in his eyes, they were lunatics because they're sharing their property with one another. If you're a follower of the actual Messiah, that was the kingdom of heaven to share your property. So it depends on your point of view, I guess. So I think even though Josephus is a historian that you would count on as a pretty objective on a lot of things, he does have his biases, and you got to discount those.
Yeah, and also, a lot of people are not aware of the fact that Josephus descends from one of the priestly lines of Jews, not the Levites, but I think it's like a cousin branch of the Levites or something like that. I forget the exact names of this branch off the top of my head, but you would think that would give them a bias for the Jewish priests, wouldn't you?
Yeah, it could, except that the Jewish priests under Herod the Great were kind of imported in, so they're not the what you would call in line with the priesthood that some of the more religious Jews at the time would have wanted. So I think Josephus essentially, instead of looking at things based on heritage and everything, I think he looked at things based on money and wealth as much as anything else. And a lot of the more well-connected people he liked to chum up with. And the same can be said with Saul, who is the historical Paul. He was quite wealthy, and he also was active alongside some of the wealthier priests of the time into the 60s. You know, and that's an interesting story in and of itself, which I don't think I've brought up yet, but we might as well do that right now. Saul is mentioned by Josephus in 62 A.D., right after the stoning of James the Just. And Saul was got a group of guys together, and they were persecuting the poorer people, similar to the Saul in the New Testament in Acts, who does the same thing after the stoning of Stephen. So what we have in Acts is a rewrite of a historical event that actually happened in 62 A.D., but the book of Acts puts it back into 35 A.D. And the reason they do that is that we don't want to see the hero of the New Testament, who is Paul, be associated with the murder of James, which he really was. So what you do is they put it back into the time of 35 A.D., before he becomes a member of the movement, where in actuality it was after he had been expelled from the movement. So you see how the Gospels and the book of Acts can really twist the actual history and the politics of the time in just that one event.
Which is, of course, why you can't just take the Bible or the New Testament as a historical document without error or flaw just because it says it is.
No, I think people that do that are going to be making a lot of mistakes. Now, here's another example along the lines of proving that Judas the Galilean was not the Messiah according to most Christians. In the book of Acts, in the 5th chapter, it said that Judas was killed, and then after him, Judas the Galilean was killed, and his followers were scattered. And this was supposedly said by Gamaliel, who was a 35 A.D. character. Yet we know from Josephus that Judas was killed in around 45 A.D. So here we have Gamaliel talking about Judas that actually happened in the future. And then he talks about Judas the Galilean at the census, which is a 6 A.D. event. But yet in Josephus's writings, right after the death of Judas, it's not Judas the Galilean that dies, it's the sons of Judas the Galilean were crucified. So in this passage in Acts, they not only get the chronology wrong, but they have substituted Judas the Galilean for the sons of Judas the Galilean, and they called Judas the Galilean a one-hit wonder, that he became nothing. But by Josephus's writings, the whole nation was crazy after his teachings up until 70 A.D. So it's like the reality, and there is no reality to the Acts passage. I mean, it's just a total mess up of what history really was. But most people don't realize that, and they just accept it.
So the whole Acts is really a rewrite of history to suit the author's movement or his agenda.
Yeah, he's making a new history. He's taking bits and pieces from actual history, changing their meanings, and making his own history. Because I can point to point after point after point, which I've done in the book, of what the actual history was and what Acts made of it. And lots of times the dates are way off. Sometimes the dates are fairly even, but the meanings are generally totally different. So you come up with a church history that is totally bogus.
Well, is there any possibility that this could have something to do with the fact that there was such a long period from the death of Jesus till when the first gospel started showing up on the market, and when the other books came out later on? was maybe to give time for the people at the time to die off and there to be little to no memory of the actual record of the time so people wouldn't question it?
The memory of the actual Messiah would have been with his Jewish followers. They were mostly all slaughtered in the Jewish war. So you just had a small remnant of Jews that survived that were actual followers. They had nothing to do with the creation of Jesus of Nazareth, which now is a Gentile invention for Gentiles. Of course, there's no memory of the real Jesus because those people have all been killed. They're all dead. So that's one reason why people don't question, because they don't know any better. And to this day, people don't question because they don't know any better.
Well, nobody wants to go in there and look and find out any better either. I mean, everybody I've ever seen that goes to a church that's a fundamentalist Christian, it did good to read any of their Bible at all instead of letting the pastor quote it, much less look up the history of the church. Yeah, but it's not such an easy thing because the history of the church has been developing for the last 2,000 years, and it's hard to go back. And to be honest, I stumbled upon an awful lot of the things I found out. You know, I really had to think about it. This is like 10 years in the making from when I first started thinking about these things and putting them together. So it's like most people don't have the time or the inclination to do that. They take it on faith that what they're being told is true. Maybe they shouldn't, but that's the normal thing to do. And I tell you, most people that are preaching, most people that are believing, they're honest people. They actually think what they're doing is correct. So I don't have any problem with that. Oh, I would agree with you 100%, especially under the Protestant movement. All these churches you go to here in America, almost every one of them, every preacher in there, they know that they believe what they're teaching and what they're preaching, and they have not actually researched themselves. And, what would you really expect people to do with an organization that's 2,000 years old other than to say it couldn't have survived 2,000 years if it was wrong? Well, I could also say it never would have survived had it been historical, because myth a lot of times is much more powerful than truth. Because if you're looking at the actual truth of the Messiah who was put to death, didn't come back, that would have lost its luster, and it was starting to lose its luster by the 70 AD because there were people that were branching off and wanting to do things other than wait for Jesus to return. Can you imagine that lasting 2,000 years, still waiting for him to return? The myth of Jesus being God and all this is the power of this new gospel that was created. So that it lasted is really not as surprising as if the original would have lasted, because I don't think the original would have lasted. Well, it wouldn't have lasted if he didn't. Well, I don't know. It lasted even a minute with him not coming back. So, well, for one thing, it wouldn't have lasted had not the Gospel of Mark been invented, because there were only a few followers of the original movement that were alive after 70 AD. So that movement was essentially smashed. Well, what about the Nag Hammadi text? Were those any close to the time? The Gnostic texts, now those are, gosh, it depends on how you read it. Most people say, point to the 2nd century AD. Where did they originate? And not in this book. I didn't deal with it in this particular book, but I've got another book that I've got that's already written that I do speculate a bit on the origins of the Gnostic movement, and I really do believe they also originated through Paul's teachings, but not that Paul was perfectly teaching Gnostic views. I think he had a lot of things in his teachings that later teachers took and ran with them and kind of developed their own viewpoints. But I think he kind of set the table, and I think they were developed out of his Christ movement, which came from the 40s, the 30s and 40s,
and then he had kind of left those, been driven away from them by the Jewish Jesus movement, the Jews. And then Paul concentrates after 70 AD on creating a Jesus of Nazareth movement, while there were still remnants of the old Christ movement in differing places that really didn't focus on a historical being. They're more into the spiritual, because his Christ movement was a spiritual movement, not one of history. So it's very confusing. I don't know if anybody will ever prove the actual beginnings of it, but if I had to bet, I would say that it kind of morphed from his Christ movement from the 40s. And over time, different teachers took it different directions.
Okay, and what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Because they don't they also mention Christ? Or they talk about a teacher of righteousness, don't they?
Right, and they really don't mention Jesus by name, but it's interesting that the Zealots, you've heard of Masada, where the grandson of Judas the Galilean leads his group to Masada, and this is like 73 AD, and for like 3 years they're surrounded by the Romans, and eventually the Romans have built this ramp up this mountain, and they're gonna just slaughter all the Zealots there. So what they do is they commit suicide. So one of the interesting things about this Zealot group is they were found there were a lot of Dead Sea Scroll type materials. So the Zealots also were partakers of the Dead Sea Scroll materials. And whether or not they actually created them or they just used them, the Dead Sea Scrolls did have a significant impact on the early Jesus movement in Judea. So they're important. Probably the champion of that type of research would be Robert Eisenman, who claims that the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of them are referring to the actual Jewish Jesus movement in the early first century. He's kind of on his own on that from most scholars, because most scholars think that the Dead Sea Scrolls originated much earlier, but the dating is moving towards his position, plus what I've come up with has moved the Christian movement back in time so much that they look like Mr. Eisenman, Professor Eisenman might be the only one that's right on that issue.
Well,
but yeah, they were very important. Paul probably knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls, and in some of his writings, he also uses some of the Dead Sea Scroll concepts, but he turns them on their head. And he does that with a lot of scriptures, like Sarah being the mother of the promise. So she's the mother of the Gentiles, not the Jews, which is in total contradiction to what the book of Genesis says. But yet Paul would take scripture and turn them 180 degrees to make his own point. So Paul is also familiar with the Dead Sea Scroll concepts, and the book of Mark also has some of those, but they're inverted and not exactly the way they would have been used by the original disciples.
Well, there's a lot of talk going on in the chat room about Judas Iscariot, and I couldn't help but wonder, do you think there's a connection between him and Judas the Galilean of some sort?
There is in one sort. I don't think Judas Iscariot was a historical person. If you look at Paul's writings, and I had talked about this a little earlier, it talks about on the night that he was betrayed. Well, actually, in Paul's writings, it says in the Greek, it's delivered up. It's not betrayed. That's one of our interpretations that we put into Paul's writings. And later in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul talks about when Jesus is resurrected, he appears to the 12. If you read the book of Mark, Jesus appears to the 11, because Judas Iscariot is the one that betrays him. Okay, but earlier, by the time when Paul was writing in the year 40 or so, he knows nothing about Judas Iscariot, because he talks about Jesus appearing to the 12. And then there's other support in the Slavonic Josephus and the Gospel of Peter also that talk about there's no concept of a Judas Iscariot.
Okay.
Iscariot is a garbling of Sicarios, which is like a dagger man, and this is part of the fourth philosophy of Judas the Galilean. So in a sense, calling Judas Iscariot a traitor is like saying the Zealots were a traitor to Paul's message, which they were. But in reality, Judas the Galilean is the original, and Paul's Jesus of Nazareth is essentially him, Paul, being betrayed by Judas the Galilean. So you are right when you Judas Iscariot is kind of a stand-in for a philosophy that Paul is against.
Okay. Now,
so you're correct in that.
Okay. KC in the chat room asked, what is the difference between the Zionist Jews and the Orthodox Jews?
That's a current day question. I deal for 2,000 years ago. Is it the Zionists that they want Israel to be their country? I guess I don't know. Orthodox Jews could be living anywhere.
I'm not exactly 100% sure.
Current day question, which I don't focus on.
Okay. I don't know why he asked that one, but he did put it in there. And I do know myself personally that I think there is a difference. I think, and I don't know, I don't want to lie, but I'm not going to say this for sure, folks. But if I'm not mistaken, I think the Zionists are, they're wanting to bring in a new world order under God on Mount Zion, or, they consider their movement part of Mount Zion, in other words, something of that nature, whereas Orthodox Jews are, they're a lot more generic, in other words. They're just, they go exactly by the book, in other words, pretty much. Well, maybe this is him calling correct us. We got a call coming in. Might get it straight here.
Okay.
Caller, you're on the air. Hello? Well, I didn't lose him, did I? Well, I thought add. Caller, if you're listening in, can you try to call in again? I might have hit the wrong button. I could have sworn I hit add to group, though. All right, well, we still got 23 minutes to give him a chance to call back in. Hopefully he will. And if I hit the wrong button, I do apologize, folks. But anyway, that was just my guesswork. I had to actually, sometime after the show and after supper, go look it up and, see what the difference is for myself. So, at any rate, how would you say that would account for the Gospel of Judas that they have recently found if he was a fictional character?
Well, I mean, even if you have a fictional character, for instance, I'm claiming Jesus of Nazareth is a fictional character, and there have been thousands of books written about him. Any fictional character, as long as somebody believes that they're true, they don't even have to believe it's true. They can still write a book and put their own views into that character. Nobody knew Judas Iscariot in person because he didn't exist. So it's somebody writing back into history and using his name. That probably happens a lot. People write about Paul. They write about Mary Magdalene. There's a Gospel of Mary. Isn't there a Gospel of Mary Magdalene? Gospel of Philip, a Gospel of Thomas. Were these guys actually attached to those Gospels, or were their names attached to the Gospels by later people? And that's my guess with the whole idea with the Gospel of Judas.
Okay.
I don't think there was. There might have been a philosophy of this was a Gnostic gospel, and that only Judas and Jesus knew the real secret of what was going on, and everybody else didn't. Well, again, historically speaking, there's no truth to that. But in their thinking and their religion of that time and that Gnostic thinking, it played well with their followers. But I don't think there's any historical truth to it.
I found it very interesting that the Gospel of Judas was not found with the rest of the Hog Namati, you have to ask yourself, why was it separate?
Well, you know, it's probably just a coincidence or just a luck of just luck that any of the documents were found. You know, there could have been groups throughout, you know, the whole Roman Empire that have Gnostic beliefs that were writing things down. It's just that probably 99% of them, or even more, have been lost to history. So it's just like what we found is maybe just out of dumb luck was what was left. But that doesn't mean that that was the only thing that was written. There might have been tons of stuff that had been lost, you know, over time, or it's still there and hadn't been discovered yet. That's possible too.
Yeah, a lot of things possible. There could still be more to come as far as that goes.
Oh, it could be. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in, 1947? You know, so it's like they existed, and there might be other things that exist somewhere that haven't been found yet. That's a possibility.
Buried by the sands of time.
Exactly.
So, now one of the things I was going to ask you about was there any other secular historians other than Josephus in Israel at the time?
Not that really that you have a history of the times. No. Like you said, you have Tacitus and Suetonius, who are Roman historians. Pliny was an administrator. He writes a little bit about Christians. But other than that, there really isn't anything that talks about first century Christianity other than those authors. So, you know, we don't have a whole lot to work from, but yet what's there presents a totally different picture from what the Gospels present. So,
right.
You know, you have to make a decision. You know, if you're just going to decide that I'm going to close my eyes and my ears and not listen or see for myself, then you accept what's out there. But it wouldn't be a bad idea to give it a chance and look and compare. You know,
well, where would you recommend people to start looking at? I mean, I know they can get your book. They can go to your website, which I have linked at my website, and I've put in the chat room a couple of times at www.danielunterbrink.com. But where else would you recommend people to start looking?
Well, I mean, there are... Barry Wilson wrote a good book called When Jesus Became Christian, and he kind of fleshes out the difference between Paul's movement and the Jewish Jesus movement. S.G.F. Brandon, back in the 50s and 60s, he even wrote a book called, Brandon did, called Jesus and the Zealots. So, you know, what my idea is of Judas the Galilean isn't completely new. There have been people that have suggested these things, but just haven't put all of it together like I have. So Brandon would be a good resource. Professor Eisenman, although his writings are really hard to get through, but he has just a wealth of information. Chaim Jacoby, he's passed away a few years ago. He has some very good books on the Mythmaker is one book that he wrote, and Revolution in Judea was another book that he wrote back in the 70s that really give a good idea, give you a sense of what was going on at the time in Judea. So I would suggest those books, and if you get my book, I have in the bibliography, I have some of the names of some people that I think that are top notch. Majority of scholarship, I think, they just follow what's been taught them before, and I don't think there's much new there. But there are a few individuals, I think, that are kind of thinking outside the box, and they're stressing different aspects of Jesus' life. Margaret Starbird talks about Mary Magdalene and maybe Jesus being married. Well, that's one aspect of what I'm talking about. James Tabor talks about the Jesus dynasty, where there was the family of Jesus involved in his ministry. Well, Judas the Galilean, that the dynasty is there. So you have elements of the truth, I think, that people some scholars are going after, and I think what I've got is kind of everything that is out there kind of placed in one book. And I'm not claiming to know 100% of everything. I just think this is a good roadmap to get people started. And if you want to go off in a different direction, then that's the right of the individual to do that. But those are some of the people I think that would be good resources for people to look at and study.
Okay. Now, there was one you mentioned a minute ago, Margaret Starbird, I think it was.
Yeah.
Was she a theologian?
She's an amateur theologian of a sort. She's a researcher, but she's spent her whole life pretty much researching Mary Magdalene and all the myths and the writings about her and trying to piece together as much as she can. So she's got her own theories about stuff. In fact, some of her stuff was taken by Dan Brown and put in the Da Vinci Code. Okay, but she didn't write the Da Vinci Code. She was just, some of the stuff that she came up with was taken from her and put into that novel.
Okay.
But, she's a very, very smart woman, and you probably would be good to have her on the program sometime, because she would have a lot to offer.
Oh, I'm quite sure of that. Just trying to reach her is the trick. But now one of the things I wanted to get around to asking you was, didn't you say you're working on another book?
Well, I actually, when I had Judas of Nazareth published, I kind of had to cut the manuscript I had in two. So this would be like the first half, and I've also got like a second half that looks at Jesus from a different perspective, the Jesus of Nazareth figure. I look at his family. I look at the 12 apostles in detail. I look at all the events that are in the Gospels. I look at that in detail. Certain passages that are interesting. I look at that. The Book of Acts, I pretty much look at verse by verse, to show the history of what really went on. So it goes into a little bit more detail in some of the areas that if you say, well, geez, what about why was Judas the Galilean called Jesus? I've got a chapter on that too. So there are a little bit more detail. But what I need people to buy this book so that they'll publish the second one, because we live in a capitalistic society, and if one book doesn't make money, they're not going to publish the second one. So.
Actually, you know what? Dan Brown experienced that same thing for about 4 whole entire books. And I don't know how he pulled it off, but he managed to hit that one book that made it to the bestseller list, and then every book he ever wrote became a bestseller all of a sudden.
Yeah. But when you're first starting out, I spent the first book I wrote, I self-published, and it took me, that was in 2004, and it took me 7 or 8 years before I got a scholar, to look at anything that I wrote. So it took me a long time to get Barry Wilson to look at my materials, to get Robert Eisenman to look at my materials, and and they've endorsed the book now. But it took me a long time, and I could have very easily just given up. So I'm hoping that people will give this book a chance, read it. Tell people about it, put it on your Facebook, do whatever you can to let people know about it. And then that second book that I think will even illuminate this question even more will come out. So I'm hoping, but we'll just have to wait and see.
Okay. Now, is there anything else you have going on? Any book signings or other shows coming up or anything?
I actually, I've had quite a few radio interviews over the last couple of weeks, and I've got a couple more coming up, but nothing within the next week or so. So that's my job to start trying to drum up some business, I guess. So.
Well, I'm pretty sure these hosts will help you.
What's that?
These hosts will help you.
Yeah, I'm hoping that that the word of mouth will get out, and that people will start talking, and that's really what's going to do the most, I think. I can tell people over the radio or this or that, they got to get into it, look for themselves, read the stuff, question it, and, from that, I really think that, the interest will grow. But it's going to take a little bit of time. So I'm hoping that, like your listeners will give it a chance, and, and other radio shows that I've been on, that people will give it a chance. It's going to take time, but I'm hoping.
Okay. Now, are you willing to make yourself available to other hosts? I mean, Revolution Radio's probably got some 60-odd hosts on here. If they should contact me and ask for your contact info, you mind giving it out to them so they can contact you for a show?
Oh, I'd be thrilled. Yeah, that'd be great. I would be willing to do the show anytime.
Okay, well, hopefully then some of these folks will get a hold of me. And, you radio hosts out there listening, I don't know, can't remember if I've made this statement before or not, but, we're out there to get the word out, and that, I think, includes sharing guests with each other and, helping the guests get their word out. We're acting as hosts, as facilitators, and, if you can get another host to interview them and their listeners hear them, you're facilitating. So feel free to ask me anytime about any of my guests, and as long as it's okay with them to give out their information, I'll be more than happy to, help you two hook up. So any other last-minute thoughts you'd like to throw at us?
Not really. I just want people to, that are interested in pursuing something. It's going to be different, and it's going to be a little challenging at times, and sometimes you have to sometimes go down certain paths to discover other things. So I just hope people are willing to give it a chance. And that's just my hope.
Okay. Now, I meant to ask you on the last show I did, and I ran out of time. Have you ever heard of Robert Price?
Yes, I have.
Well, if you can get a hold of him, he might be willing to endorse a future book by you, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I had, I was actually on a chat list with him that I haven't really talked to him directly in person, but he seems to be a very knowledgeable guy.
Well, yeah, he's known as the Bible Geek. He's got YouTube videos all up and down YouTube. He's easy to listen to. He's been in a few debates on there, and they put it up there and posted it. So, fascinating man. He does seem to know what he's talking about. He just kind of rattles it off like it's second nature, in other words.
I guess, the longer you're in anything, it becomes more and more second nature because, it becomes ingrained. The only trouble with that is if you're not completely correct, sometimes you can fall into bad habits, So sometimes it's good to question yourself. Even, I do the same thing when I'm looking at a passage. I go, well, what else can I see out of that? So nobody's 100% infallible. Nobody's got 100% of the answers. But I'm hoping that people will see that I at least have a new way of looking at things.
I would definitely agree with you there. Definitely a new way, and you definitely put a lot of details into documenting everything and where you got it from, and that's always makes a big impression on me. Zion, was saying in the chat room that Jesus did not come to start a new religion, but to clarify what was true from the Tanakh or the Hebrew Scriptures. That's pretty common knowledge now. Judas the Galilean, that's pretty much what he was trying to do, is just re-clarify what was in the Tanakh, wasn't he?
Yeah, and you got to remember, his big thing was following the law and getting rid of the Romans, because he believed that God was their only ruler. So again, he's very much in that tradition of following the law. So he wasn't there to create a new religion, although he did. Josephus called his movement separate from the others, but yet he's working with other Jews to do this. So it wasn't like he was, thinking of creating a new religion. he's working within the frameworks of Judaism the whole time.
Right. Alrighty then. Well, I show that we've got 5 minutes remaining, and I'm pretty sure the music's going to start here in about 3 minutes. I want to thank everybody for listening in. I couldn't have a show without my listeners anymore, and I could have a show without my guests. I want to remind everybody to please join me at www.talknowradio.net this coming Saturday at 1 p.m. Central Time. I've got the whole time zone typed down here to help people out. It's 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12 p.m. Mountain Standard Time, 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, and 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You just pick which time zone you're in and go to www.talknowradio.net and, hit the player, and as long as you're there at showtime, it'll work. The show will start coming in. So, folks, please join me there. And I want to thank you for joining me, Daniel, and everybody have a good day.
Listening to Revolution Radio.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning! Warning!
We gotta stop them! They're gonna kill us all!
See how the trouble you've started?
Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener